The spirit animals and their looms along the spice road. For some time now, in the background of our studies on loin looms, we have been pursuing the thesis that perhaps there is a kind of spirit animal in every loin loom of Asian origin along the spice road. What's actually the maritime route of the Silk Route? This is not a mere figurative representation, but rather an abstract, yet extremely functional embodiment of the spiritual animal. This could also explain why, in the majority of cases, only a certain traditional textile can be woven on traditional looms of various tribes. Likewise, throughout history, loin looms have often not found easy to adopt and integrate technical innovations by recipients from abroad. Let's look back at the loin looms that we focused on this year at
Sonntagaften.
The serpent horse of the Indona. Such a spirit animal can best be recognized by the Indona people on Flores. The Indona's warp runs horizontally to the ground, strikingly descriptive of their length in relation to their moderate width. The Indona people have the idea of a serpent horse on which a woman rides, sometimes accompanied by her husband. Such carved representations of the sea serpent have no legs. Such serpents are also associated with boats. You also encounter it in other Southeast Asian cultures, for example as stair railings at Buddhist temples in Thailand, or as longboats on the Chayo Phraya. We're talking about the Naga. It is obvious that the warp, like the loin loom of the Indona, is not just intended to represent the spirit animal figuratively, but rather embodies it in all of its properties. It also seems to be clear that such a spirit animal is only embodied by the community of warp and loom, an example its individual components, and is not represented by warp or loom on their own. The mythical bird of the Kabi. The Kabi in Assam provide another example of such a mythical-like spirit animal. According to the Kabi, they are descended from a mythical bird, the Foplakpi. Their warp is rather narrow and shorter than the Indona's warp, but in a diagonally rising orientation. We suspect, among other things, these different orientations of the warps and their proportions represent crucial expressions of the spirit animal's properties. Accordingly, diagonal orientations represent birds or flying animals, horizontals for serpents or ground animals, which the following example will describe in more detail. The crouching buffalo of the Minang. The Minangkabau used a horizontal warp on their loin loom, similar to the Indona, but much squatter and wider. As their name also conveys, their philosophical expression in creative arts such as architecture and clothing, they refer to a leisurely betel-nut-chewing buffalo as a spiritual animal and cultural donor. In terms of figures, one may not discover any depictions of animals in all three examples of loin looms described, apart from details such as carved buffalo horns on the baton rest of the Minangkabau. But according to the observations described above, the proportional shifts in the horizontal warp alone have transformed this serpent into a corn buffalo, both grounded, down-to-earth animals. In our studies of this year, we were also able to discover a diagonally aligned warp on Kosrae Island in Micronesia. Also, it appears to be rather broad and stocky compared to the mythological bird of the Caribbean. However, we have not yet been able to discuss whether this is the embodiment of a spirit animal and, above all, which one. Dragons of the Philippines. According to such observations, the gigantic, long-woven warps in the Philippines that float diagonally through space could well be flying serpents or dragons.
The tree that causes
creation. To confirm the presence of a spirit animal in Southeast Asian loin looms, comprehensive studies of the various tribes and their mythical beliefs seem necessary. Nevertheless, if we proceed systematically, we can recognize in advance a parallel to the basic pattern of the myth, which should relate more or less to the
tree of creation.
Other features in focus. In addition to the features highlighted so far, such as the alignment and the proportion of the warp, other elements of the loin loom also seem to transmit the properties of the spirit animal. As another example, we use the back warp slopping posts on today's Minang frame loom, which are used to attach the warp board with the same inclination. We assume that this inclination of the posts was already present at their loin looms. In our opinion, this tendency comes from the spirit animal of the Minang, the buffalo, and embodies its backward pointing horns. This inclination of the warp board and its attachment can be observed in many loin looms in Western Indonesia. The various variants in Bali, but also among the Sasak on Lombok, serve as an example here. According to this thesis, these loin looms were originally supposed to be the embodiments of buffaloes.
The spirit animal of footlooms.
But what about the countless variations of footlooms on Taiwan? Which spirit animal can you discover in them? Should we discover ground animals in their often horizontal warps? With a short, not too wide nature, they could represent turtles, for example, or even other toads, such as frogs. And what about the triangular-looking warp variants, such as the Pangtak in Bhutan, or the Atayal box loom? And what spirit animal is the Gorontalo supposed to embody, with its L-shaped warp? Should it turn out to a cobra? However, it also seems questionable whether the embodiment of spirit animals can actually be found in all loin looms in Asia, and not only affected a certain era or a region. In science, foot looms are considered to be the mother of all subsequent loin loom variants in Asia. We suspect that the embodiment of a spirit animal had not yet ripped this generation of foot-powered loin looms. They are still characterized by another era of soul transmission, honoring the tree of creation. The bird eats serpent and their tree. Presumably, at the time, the idea of a disembodied being inhabiting the tree, even giving it a soul, was still dominant. Trees are known to be living creatures with considerably long lifespans, reaching far back into the history of the family tree. This mythological tree of life gradually emerges in our thesis as the basis for the later phase of spirit animals. Various myths about the tree of life already contain two essential spirit animals that are crucial for this development: the bird and the serpent. In simple terms, all three symbols can be found in warps. The warp means the bird, a spiritual flight of fancy. The upper and the lower warp forms its wings, what means balance, while the weft represents the serpent snaking up from below in realization, which is in connection with the warp learning to fly. Both, together as a finished textile, manifest the tree of creation. By the way, both birds and serpents are considered immortal, divine beings, because of the exchange of feathers and the shedding of skin. Form follows function. What is striking is that these spirit animals were not simply realized figuratively, an example not in form of a sculptural representation, but were implemented almost exclusively as functions. We have often been able to discover this almost modern Bauhaus approach to art in loin looms, which says form follows function. This conception of art, which has been declared a modern achievement, seems to have been introduced into the first loin looms we know of in their infancy, as this conception seems to be inherent in the oldest models of foot looms from a good 6,000 years ago. The myth moth of Carby. It is said that the Carby breed a moth that lives in bamboo for the silk production. The hut and the vessels for silk production are made of bamboo, like every single component of their loom originally. This leads us to assume that the mythological bird of the Carby, which is incomparable to any other bird, is derived from this flying creature, the moth. The legend that the Carby emerged from the thousandth eggs of this bird could be a reference to the moth. Or which bird do you know that lays 1,000 eggs? The metamorphosis of the moth from a caterpillar crawling on the ground to a flying moth with the help of the silk cocoon reconciles the seemingly contradictory characteristics that we observed in the previously described spirit animals. An immortal serpent that learns to fly. No matter how confusing and mythological the idea of a flying serpent may seem to us, in a tropical environment it is part of everyday life. This observation of nature could have served as the origin of spirit animals in later eras. Cultural means of transport. Whether it's the couple riding on the serpent horse of the Indona or the cultural creating bird of the Carby, with all the spirit animals presented, it can be agreed that they are all seen as a universal spiritual and cultural means of transport and staged as such.